Welcome to Shadow Fable. If you enjoy unsettling stories that creep into your mind and linger long after the lights go out, make sure to subscribe. Tonight's tale is one of quiet terror, of things seen and unseen in the mirrors that surround us. The house was never supposed to be theirs. Oliver and Grace Langley had no plans to move, no plans to uproot their quiet life in Chicago, where everything was predictable, familiar. But when Grace's uncle, whom she had never really known, left them his estate in his will, curiosity led them to visit. It was an old Victorian home on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by hills that swallowed the last traces of sunlight too early in the evening. The house, they agreed, had charm. It was oddly untouched, as if someone had been expecting to return at any moment. Dust thickened over unused furniture, but the rooms were filled with ornate decor. Intricate wallpaper, mahogany shelves lined with aging books, and most distinctively mirrors. So many mirrors. They were in every room, framed in brass, silver, or deep, carved wood. Some small, some enormous, leaning against walls, reflecting light in peculiar ways. Grace admired them, calling them beautiful, saying they made the house feel larger, brighter. Oliver wasn't so sure. Something about them unsettled him. The first night was uneventful, just the normal discomfort of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. But by the second night, Oliver noticed something strange. It was the mirror in the hallway, just outside their bedroom. When he passed it, something felt off, like a delay, a hesitation in the reflection. He stopped, staring at himself. Was it just his imagination? The dim lighting? He leaned closer. His reflection followed, but for the briefest moment he swore he saw it move just a fraction of a second too late. He blinked. Everything was normal. He shook it off, telling himself it was just travel fatigue, a trick of the dim lighting, the way old glass warped images. But then it happened again, and again, each time just a flicker, just long enough to make him doubt himself. He started avoiding that mirror altogether, but the house had too many others. And soon, it wasn't just that one, it was all of them. Little things at first. He'd catch movement in the corner of his eye when he wasn't moving. A shift in the angle of his reflection that didn't match his own. A breath he didn't take. One evening, as he brushed his teeth, he turned his head slightly and saw something that made his blood run cold. His reflection didn't turn with him. It was still facing forward. Oliver froze, the toothbrush slipping from his fingers. His pulse pounded in his ears. He blinked hard, trying to force his brain to reset. The reflection was normal again. He let out a shaky breath and stumbled back, away from the mirror, nearly knocking over the towel rack in his hurry to leave the bathroom. Something was wrong with this house. Grace didn't notice anything strange. She laughed off his concerns, saying old mirrors did weird things. Glass warps, light bends. "You're psyching yourself out," she told him, shaking her head. But Oliver knew what he saw, and soon he wasn't the only one. One night, Grace woke up gasping. Oliver jolted upright. "What? What is it?" She pressed a hand to her chest, catching her breath. I thought I saw something in the mirror." Oliver felt his stomach tighten. "What did you see?" She hesitated. "I don't know, a shape. It was standing in the corner of the room, but when I looked, nothing was there." She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "God, now you have me paranoid." But Oliver wasn't laughing. The next day, he covered the mirrors. Every single one. Grace protested, calling it ridiculous, but he didn't care. Something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let it keep watching them. That night, for the first time in weeks, He slept soundly. Until 3:12 a.m., a sharp sound snapped him awake. A rustling, a shifting. He sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thick. He turned toward Grace and stopped. His throat clenched. The mirror. He had covered it earlier that day, draping a heavy blanket over the glass. But now, the blanket was on the floor, and the mirror was uncovered. And inside the reflection, Grace was sitting up in bed, but in reality, she was still lying down, deep in sleep. Oliver's body went rigid. The Grace in the mirror turned its head toward him and smiled. A slow, unnatural curl of the lips, too wide, too knowing. Oliver couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. His reflection was normal again. Grace was still asleep beside him. The room was silent. But Oliver knew. He knew. They weren't alone in this house. Oliver sat frozen, his breath shallow. His skin crawled with the lingering sensation of being watched, of something unseen still lurking just beyond his perception. He forced himself to look away from the mirror, to wrench his gaze back to Grace's sleeping form beside him. She was breathing evenly, undisturbed. She hadn't seen what he saw. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for the blanket that had inexplicably fallen to the floor. His fingers trembled as he pulled it back over the mirror, careful not to look directly into the glass. As soon as the mirror was covered, the heavy pressure in the air seemed to lessen, just a little. But sleep wouldn't return to him. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spiraling. The next morning, he found Grace in the living room, standing in front of the grand floor-length mirror near the fireplace. The blanket he had placed over it was gone. His heart dropped. "Grace, did you take that down?" She turned, frowning. "What?" "The cover. I put a blanket over this one last night." Grace gave him a confused look. "I didn't touch it." Oliver swallowed hard. He glanced around. The other mirrors, every single one he had covered, were uncovered. The blankets were nowhere to be seen. Someone, or something, had removed them. "Oliver, you need to stop this," Grace said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not sleeping. You're barely eating. You're scaring yourself." He wanted to argue, to make her see what he saw. But how could he explain something that refused to be real when it was under direct scrutiny? How could he convince her when even he questioned his own sanity? He decided then he had to test it. That night, after Grace had gone to bed, Oliver sat alone in the dimly lit hallway, facing the mirror he had first noticed was wrong. His reflection stared back, the flickering candlelight casting deep shadows under his eyes. "I know you're there," he murmured. Nothing. He took a slow breath. "You can hear me, can't you?" The silence stretched, heavy and waiting. Then, just as he was about to give up, it happened. His reflection blinked, just a second too late. Oliver's breath hitched. He felt the hairs on his arms rise. Then, his reflection's lips parted. Oliver hadn't opened his mouth, but the thing in the mirror had. It was smiling. His pulse thundered in his ears. His chest tightened, every primal instinct screaming at him to run, to leave this house and never come back. But his body wouldn't move. Then it spoke. A voice, soft and hollow, like wind through an empty room. "You don't belong here." Oliver lurched back, crashing into the wall behind him. The candle tipped over, spilling wax across the floor. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged. eyes locked onto the mirror. His reflection was normal again. He staggered back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. Grace stirred, mumbling sleepily. "Ollie, what's wrong?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, his mind was made up. "We need to leave," he said over breakfast, gripping his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Today." Grace lowered her fork. "Oliver, please, Grace. Something is wrong with this house. I don't care if I sound crazy. I need you to trust me." She studied him for a long time. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay." Relief flooded him. He didn't care about the inheritance, about whatever legal mess they'd have to sort through. He just wanted to get out. They packed in silence. Oliver didn't let himself look into any mirrors, didn't dare glance at his reflection, until Grace called out from the bedroom. "Ollie, did you move this?" He hesitated, then walked toward the sound of her voice. She was standing by the bedroom mirror. His stomach twisted. "Move what?" She pointed. There, in front of the mirror, was a small, hand-carved wooden box. He had never seen it before. "It was on the dresser when I woke up," Grace murmured. Oliver swallowed hard. He stepped closer, hesitantly reaching for the box. It was cool to the touch, its surface smooth and polished. He lifted the lid. Inside was a single object, a photograph. He pulled it out with shaking hands. It was an old black and white picture of their bedroom, but in the mirror's reflection, there was a man, standing exactly where Oliver stood now. His face was obscured, blurred, as if something had smeared the image, but his posture, his stance, was identical to Oliver's own. A chill ran through him. Behind him, Grace let out a sharp breath. He turned. She was staring at the mirror. Her reflection was gone. Only Oliver's stood there, smiling. Oliver's stomach twisted into a knot so tight he thought he might be sick. His own reflection stood there, grinning, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't belong to him. His knees nearly buckled. He whipped around to look at Grace, expecting her to panic, to scream. But she only stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space where her reflection should have been. "Grace," Oliver whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you see this?" She didn't answer. She took a single step forward, then another. She reached out, fingertips barely grazing the glass. And the mirror rippled, like a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. Oliver's breath caught. The smile on his reflection grew wider. "Grace," he choked out. "Step back." But she didn't move. Her eyes were locked onto the shifting glass, mesmerized. Then, a hand shot out. Not hers, not his. A pale, skeletal hand, emerging from the mirror with unnatural speed, fingers stretching toward her wrist. Oliver lunged. He grabbed Grace by the shoulders and yanked her backward just as the hand nearly closed around her arm. She gasped, stumbling into him, and the mirror went still. The hand was gone. But Oliver's reflection was still smiling. And now, it wasn't alone. Dozens of figures loomed just behind it, deep in the mirror's depths. Shadowy, shifting things, their hollow faces indistinct, as if they had been smeared like wet paint. They stood in rows, packed together, motionless except for one detail. They were all smiling, wide, hungry grins. Grace was trembling against him. "Ollie," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book from the nightstand, and hurled it at the mirror with all his strength. The glass shattered. For a moment, all sound seemed to vanish. Then, a scream, not from the mirror, from inside his own head. A high, piercing wail that vibrated through his skull, rattling his teeth, squeezing behind his eyes. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the sound reverberated inside him. Grace was shouting, shaking him, but he couldn't hear her over the agonizing noise. Then, silence. The pain disappeared. Oliver opened his eyes. The mirror was gone. Only jagged shards remained, scattered across the floor like fallen stars. And the figures were gone. All of them. But as he looked at the shattered pieces, his blood ran cold. Each shard reflected something different. A different room. A different time. In one, their bed was unmade, sheets tossed aside. In another, the dresser was missing. In another, the walls were bare. Each broken fragment showed a version of the room that didn't match the reality around them. And in one dash, one shard showed the mirror, still intact, and in its reflection, Oliver was still standing there, still smiling, watching, waiting. The breath left his lungs. "We have to go," he rasped, pulling Grace to her feet. "Now!" They didn't pack. They didn't look back. They ran. By the time they reached the car, the house stood silent behind them. The windows reflected the dull morning light, ordinary and undisturbed. Nothing moved inside, but as Oliver turned the key in the ignition, he made the mistake of glancing at the rearview mirror. For just a second, just long enough to see the house's front door standing wide open, and in the shadows beyond it, something standing there, smiling.